What if the most rigid, heavily policed border in human history wasn't drawn across a map, but like across your own body?
Yeah, I mean, it is a profound shift in perspective. We're just so used to moving through our daily lives, assuming certain things are, fixed realities of nature.
Right, totally. Well, today in the hypothesis, we are taking a deep dive into the source material that challenges, like one of the biggest fixed realities we have. We're looking at the strict male and female gender binary.
Hmm.
And we're asking you to consider something pretty radical. Like, what if the global enforcement of a rigid gender binary wasn't primarily driven by biological discovery or, religious morality?
Right.
What if, at its core, it was a calculated financial tool used to reshape the world for private property and colonial capitalism?
It's a massive premise, to say the least. And to be clear, right at the top, our goal today isn't to take a political stance or endorse a specific ideology. Our mission is just to impartially explore this really fascinating historical hypothesis.
Hmm.
We are drawing from a comprehensive research paper titled The Geopolitics of the Binary by independent researcher Victor H. Sertouche, which synthesizes just a massive amount of historical, legal, and socioeconomic data.
Yeah, it's a dense read.
It is. And the central argument is that the creation of a strict gender binary was an absolute structural requirement for private property regimes to function globally.
Okay, let's unpack this because to even entertain this idea, we first have to clear away some deeply ingrained assumptions we all probably have about biology and human history.
Oh, absolutely.
It's kind of like assuming the 40-hour work week is a fundamental biological trait of the human species rather than, a relatively recent economic invention. So we have to start with the ultimate origin story we're all taught, which is the hunter-gatherer myth.
But right, the classic caveman narrative.
Exactly. The idea that since the dawn of time, men went out to hunt the mammoths and women stayed back to, I don't know, gather berries and tend the fires.
Yeah, and that narrative has been heavily relied upon for centuries. It's been used to argue that patriarchy and a strict gender division of labor are just these universal prehistorical facts. But the archaeological and anthropological data presented in the paper systematically disproves this.
Really? How so?
Well, for instance, a recent study of 63 different hunter-gatherer societies found that in 79% of them, women were actively involved in hunting.
Wait, 79%?
Yeah.
If that's true, how did the myth of the male mammoth hunter become the dominant textbook story for, 100 years?
The paper suggests it was largely a projection of 19th century Victorian values backward onto the past. When early anthropologists, who were mostly, European men, looked at ancient evidence, they just interpreted it through the lens of their own deeply binarized society.
Oh, interesting. So they saw what they wanted to see.
Basically, yeah. But if you look at societies like the Ochre people in Central Africa today, gender roles remain highly fluid. Women participate in net hunting right alongside the men, and men are deeply involved in childcare and gathering.
Wow.
Yeah, there isn't this rigid, impenetrable wall between what a male body does and what a female body does in daily camp life.
So if the state and scientific institutions didn't care about categorizing biology for thousands of years, I'm guessing this sudden obsession in the 19th century had something to do with the Industrial Revolution, right?
Yeah.
Like needing bodies for factories.
Yes. What's fascinating here is how the scientific narrative was deliberately shifted to justify that exact economic reality. Because before the 18th century, many European traditions operated on what historians call a one-sex model.
The one-sex model.
Yeah, ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates actually viewed human sex as existing on a spectrum, with bodies containing different balances of the same fundamental elements.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't about two opposing boxes at all.
Far from it. But the paper points to the 19th century as a turning point, an era historians of medicine refer to as the Age of Gonads.
The Age of Gonads. That's quite a name.
It is, right. But the medical community decided that the presence of ovaries or testicles was the absolute defining marker of true sex. Physicians basically displaced religious and legal authorities in determining a person's identity. They even began performing non-consensual normalization surgeries on intersex bodies to force them into this newly invented binary mold.
But why go to such extreme lengths? I mean, why did the state care so deeply about the internal anatomy of every single person? Think about it. Why does your driver's license need to declare your biological sex?
It comes down to a concept the paper introduces called biopower. Let's define that simply. Biopower is the state's need to manage, regulate, and control the bodies and lives of its subjects to optimize them for economic output. So to produce new labor for the exploding industrial and colonial economy, the state needed everybody categorized into a legible reproductive unit. Darwinian evolutionary theory was actually weaponized to support this.
Wait, how so? Darwin was just observing finches. Right.
Right, but the theory was co-opted. By framing reproduction as the ultimate single purpose of biological existence, any non-binary or non-heterosexual identity was suddenly labeled evolutionarily useless.
I see.
And if you are deemed evolutionarily useless in an industrializing world, you are deemed economically unproductive.
That makes total sense. That connects the biological myth directly to the economic agenda. The state needed laborers, so it mandated a reproductive system to churn them out, which brings us to the core of the hypothesis, right? The transition from communal land living to individual fee simple ownership.
Exactly.
But let's pause for a second. Fee simple, in plain English, that just means you hold the deed to the land outright. Like,
Yeah.
It's yours, you can sell it, you are the singular owner.
That is the exact definition. It is the absolute bedrock of modern real estate and private property.
But I have to push back a little here. Because when colonial powers were expanding across the globe and forcing these legal structures onto people, weren't they publicly claiming they were on a civilizing mission based on Christian morality? Like, was it really just about the money and the property deeds?
That is the crucial tension the paper addresses. The Victorian and Christian morality was, according to this hypothesis, the moral camouflage for an economic imperative.
Moral camouflage.
Yeah. Let's look at the functional logic of a colonial state. For a state to extract wealth, meaning to effectively tax land and command labor, it needs legibility. Think about how a tax system works. It needs things to be simple, organized, and trackable.
Right, because you can't send a tax collector to a fluid extended kinship network where land is collectively managed by the elders and passed down through the mother's line. Like, who signs the check? Who holds the liability?
Exactly. The colonial state simply couldn't process that complexity. Pre-colonial societies often operated on shared stewardship. In many Indigenous American and African societies, land was communal, inheritance flowed matrilineally, and social roles were based on seniority or spiritual function, not biological sex. So to extract wealth, the empire desperately needed a stable, legible unit. It needed the nuclear family, headed by a singular taxable male owner, where wealth passed through patrilineal primogeniture, which means from father to eldest son.
Right. And to make that happen, they had to legally invent the head of household, which brings up the concept of coverture mentioned in the sources, which is genuinely shocking to read about. Under European law at the time, a married woman's legal personhood was completely subsumed into her husband. She was essentially legally invisible.
Yeah, the marriage contract was basically a property transfer where a woman became a dependent asset. She couldn't own land, sign contracts, or even have legal custody of her own children.
It's basically an aggressive, hostile corporate restructuring of human families. And colonial powers exported that legal framework globally to completely re-engineer societies. The paper highlights the pre-colonial Yoruba society in West Africa.
The Yoruba example is incredibly revealing. Their social hierarchy was originally based entirely on age and seniority. The language itself was essentially genderless. Terms for man or woman as we use them didn't carry the same weight until colonization.
Wow.
Women were often economically independent, powerful traders and farmers.
So imagine your entire societal value and economic power was based on your wisdom and your age. Then overnight, a foreign power arrives and says, nope, none of that matters. Only your anatomy determines if you can hold property.
Right. When the British arrived, they instituted juridical reforms that placed communal lineage land strictly into what they called the trust of men. Those powerful Yoruba women were suddenly, by stroke of a pen, dispossessed of their primary assets.
It wasn't a cultural misunderstanding. It was a strict requirement for the new property regime. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if the entire legal and financial system suddenly requires a male head of household to function, what happens to the societies and the specific people who do not fit that binary?
Yeah.
Because if your family structure doesn't fit the new tax forms, the state doesn't just ask you to conform, it confiscates your land.
The historical record shows that this restructuring was carried out through violent legal erasure. Let's look at North America and the Dawes Act of 1887. The United States government realized that communal land tenure on indigenous reservations was a massive obstacle to settler expansion. So they passed the Dawes Act to literally break the tribal bond by dividing reservations into individual 160-acre plots.
But those plots weren't just handed out to anyone, right? They were explicitly granted only to the recognized head of the family, which the U.S. government strictly defined as a male. So in matrilineal nations, like the Cherokee or the Iroquois, where women were traditionally the stewards of the land, those women were instantly stripped of their authority. They were forced to become legally dependent on husbands or fathers just to survive in the new system.
And the law went even further in its erasure. What happened to the two-spirit people? Individuals in indigenous societies who embodied a third gender or lived outside the heteropatriarchal family unit were simply not recognized as legal persons for the purposes of land allotment.
That's horrifying.
They were legally erased from the property map. And we have to look at the mechanism of the trust trap within the Dawes Act. The allotted land was held in trust by the federal government for 25 years, meaning the new male owners couldn't get credit or sell it.
Meanwhile, any surplus land, like the millions of acres left over after these individual male plots were carved out, was immediately sold off to white settlers.
The numbers are staggering. By the time the Dawes Act was repealed in 1934, American Indians had lost roughly 86 million acres. That was nearly two-thirds of the land they had held in 1887.
Oh my gosh.
And as the paper points out, this wasn't a glitch in the law, it was the intended feature. Forcing indigenous people into the binarized nuclear family destroyed the collective resistance that comes from communal land ownership.
And they reinforced this through the residential boarding schools.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
separating children by sex, banning genderless indigenous languages, and enforcing Western domestic labor roles on the girls while teaching the boys trades. It was just a total systematic override.
Exactly. And this same financial logic of erasure occurred on the other side of the world, in South Asia. In 1793, the British introduced the permanent settlement in Bengal. Before this, peasants held customary overlapping rights to the land.
Oh.
But the British converted the local revenue collectors, the zamindars, into private hereditary landowners, and they granted property titles exclusively to men. Men became the sole individuals responsible for tax payments to the British Empire.
The cascading effect of that transition is just devastating. We really need to look at the mechanism here. How did this legal shift alter the value of a human life? Because if land and wealth can only legally pass through male bloodlines, boys suddenly become financial assets, right? They can accumulate wealth.
Yes.
But girls, who were legally barred from holding those property deeds, were abruptly transformed into economic liabilities for a family.
That transition is precisely what the sources identify as the catalyst that sparked the modern, highly exploitative dowry system in India. Before this, wealth often flowed through mutual exchange or bride price, which recognized a woman's value to the community. But by locking property to the male, the woman's economic autonomy was destroyed, and dowry became a necessary compensation to the husband's family for taking on a quote-unquote liability.
And anyone completely outside that biological male-female reproductive matrix was targeted for complete economic ruin. Which brings us to the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871 in India, which specifically targeted the Hijra community.
Right. The Hijras are individuals who identify as a third gender. In pre-colonial India, they held recognized, sometimes revered social roles. They even collected revenue from specific lands, and they lived in communal households. Crucially, their wealth was passed down from guru, the teacher, to chela, the disciple.
So not a biological blood relation, just a chosen communal kinship network.
Exactly. And the British East India Company could not tolerate wealth existing outside the biological patrilineal family. It couldn't be easily tracked, taxed, or absorbed into the binarized market they were building.
Right.
So the British branded the Hijras as a criminal caste. They passed laws to explicitly seize these lands on the specific grounds that the property wasn't being inherited by blood relations.
So the police violence wasn't just bigotry, it was literally a tool of economic dispossession. Registered individuals could be arrested on site, publicly humiliated, stripped of their clothing. By criminalizing the non-binary identity, the state legally confiscated their communal wealth and brought it into the colonial treasury.
It was incredibly methodical. The gender binary was the exact shape of the keyhole they needed to unlock and empty out communal wealth globally.
But the theft didn't stop with land. The conversation in the source material pivots to the theft of labor. So what does this all mean for the people who were placed into the female category of this newly enforced binary? I mean, if you are listening to this right now and you do the bulk of the cooking, cleaning, and childcare in your home, this next part directly involves you.
This brings us to a really vital framework in the paper, which is Maria Mies's theory of housewifization.
Housewifization.
Yeah. Once the binary is established globally and the male is designated as the singular property owner and waged worker, capitalist logic creates a stark division in how human effort is valued. Waged labor, so the work the man does in the public sphere, is classified as productive and visible. It generates surplus value for the economy.
But the labor required to keep that worker alive, like the cooking, the cleaning, the emotional support, the raising of the next generation of workers, that is pushed into the private domestic sphere.
Hmm.
And under capitalism, that domestic labor is classified as non-productive.
Exactly.
That's rendered totally invisible on the balance sheets. Capitalism essentially treats women's labor the same way a factory treats a nearby river, as a naturally occurring infinite resource to dump costs into or extract from totally for free.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. By legally and culturally defining women as housewives, the capitalist system hides behind the breadwinner husband. It manages to command a massive amount of human labor through the cultural expectation of love and duty rather than paying a wage.
Right.
This is a staggering economic reality. The entire global capitalist system is subsidized by this unpaid reproductive labor.
And to maintain this massive unpaid workforce, the boundaries of the binary have to be constantly policed. A river doesn't complain when you extract from it, but human beings do.
Yeah.
So the paper talks about ongoing primitive accumulation.
Yeah, this is the idea that the violent enforcement of the binary isn't just history. It requires continuous maintenance to keep the fence between the waged world and the unwaged world standing. The paper cites historical witch hunts in Europe, which violently broke women's economic autonomy and traditional medical knowledge.
It also cites the institution of chattel slavery, violently forcing enslaved people into white supremacist gender categories to maximize their utility and reproduction as property.
And it points to ongoing gender-based violence today. The systemic tolerance of this violence serves a grim economic function. It enforces the nuclear family structure, keeps dependents fearful and reliant on the head of household, and ensures the continued extraction of that unpaid domestic subsidy.
So what does this all mean if we step back and look at everything we've unpacked?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the gender binary is revealed to be much more than a set of cultural pronouns or biological assumptions. It is the structural, legal fence that separates the exploited from the waged world. It was designed by colonial powers to flatten the vast complexity of human traditions, to make populations manageable, legible, and easily taxable. The paper strongly concludes that true decolonization requires more than just land acknowledgments or diverse hiring. It requires dismantling this heteropatriarchal governance model at its very root.
We started by questioning our basic assumptions about the human body. We've seen how the myth of the male mammoth hunter was weaponized to justify an industrial agenda. We've traced how the Dawes Act stole 86 million acres of native land by enforcing the male head of household, erasing two-spirit people in the process.
Yeah.
We saw the British Empire criminalize the Hijras in India to seize their communal wealth. And we explored how the legal invention of the housewife created an invisible, unpaid subsidy, like a free river of labor that still runs the global economy today. It is a paradigm-shifting way to look at why our taxes, our property laws, and our family roles look the way they do right now.
It leaves us with a profound, almost dizzying realization. If the gender binary was fundamentally an imperial infrastructure built to serve private property, well, this raises an important question for all of us.
Okay, what is it?
If our entire global capitalist system was quite literally built on the free labor and confiscated land enabled by this strict two-box system, what would a truly post-binary, decolonized global economy actually look like? Could capitalism, as we currently understand it, even survive without this massive, invisible subsidy?
Man, that is a question that completely rewires how you look at the world around you. Thank you for joining us today to explore these heavy but deeply illuminating sources. If this deep dive into the source material shifted your perspective, please subscribe and share this with a friend who loves a good paradigm shift. Until next time, keep questioning the map.